and the subsequent declarations of war by Great Britain and France marked the official beginning of World War II. Yet across the Atlantic, the initial American response was not one of immediate alarm or commitment, but a profound and resolute hesitation. The American mood was defined by a deep-seated desire for non-entanglement, a policy enshrined in the principle of isolationism. The scars of the Great War, the tragic loss of life, the failed promise of the League of Nations, and the pervasive bitterness over unpaid European debts had cemented a national conviction. European quarrels were no longer America's concern. This popular will was codified in a series of congressional acts throughout the 1930s known as the Neutrality Acts. These laws, passed to ensure the nation would not repeat the costly mistakes of 1917, banned the sale of arms to warring nations, prohibited American citizens from traveling on belligerent ships, and restricted loans to countries at war. The intent was pure and simple: sever the economic and human ties that had dragged the United States into the previous global conflict. As the phony war settled over Europe in the winter of 1939, most Americans felt their distance was their defense. They believed a vast ocean was a better protector than any treaty or army. However, in the White House, President Franklin Delano Roosevelt recognized the existential danger posed by the twin ideologies of Nazism and Japanese imperialism. A lifelong internationalist, FDR found himself walking a tightrope, caught between the nation's overwhelming desire for peace and his own growing conviction that the fate of American democracy was inextricably linked to the survival of its allies. He understood that the Neutrality Acts, while reflecting public sentiment, functionally penalized the victims of aggression, leaving nations like Britain and France unable to access the industrial resources necessary to defend themselves. Roosevelt's first calculated move to chip away at the fortress of isolationism came in November 1939 with the revision of the Neutrality Act. He successfully pressed Congress to adopt a policy of cash and carry. Under this provision, warring nations could purchase military goods from the U.S., but they had to pay immediately in cash and transport the goods on their own ships. This was not a purely neutral measure. It was a clear benefit to Britain and France, who controlled the Atlantic sea lanes and possessed the financial resources and merchant fleets to take advantage of the arrangement. It was a small, tentative step, away from neutrality and toward becoming the arsenal of democracy. The true turning point, the moment that shattered the illusion of a safe and distant America, was the stunning military collapse of France in the spring of 1940. Within 6 short weeks, the German blitzkrieg had swept aside all resistance, leaving Great Britain to stand alone against the might of the Nazi war machine. The urgency in London was palpable. The British, led by a defiant Winston Churchill, faced the imminent threat of invasion. For President Roosevelt, the fall of France was a geopolitical earthquake, clarifying a harsh reality. If Britain fell, the United States would face a victorious and hostile Germany, unchallenged across the Atlantic. This crisis forced Roosevelt to become increasingly bold in his rhetoric and his actions. In a momentous decision that openly defied the spirit, if not the letter, of the Neutrality Acts, Roosevelt announced the Destroyers for Bases deal in September 1940. This agreement transferred 50 aging but critical American destroyers to the Royal Navy, desperately needed to combat German U-boats, in exchange for 99-year leases on British military bases in the Western Hemisphere. It was an executive action, bypassing a potentially crippling debate in Congress, and it was a public declaration that the U.S. had a vested interest in the defense of Britain. The domestic reaction was immediate and fierce, polarizing the country into 2 camps, the isolationists and the interventionists. The isolationist movement, spearheaded by the powerful America First Committee, argued passionately that the U.S. should focus solely on its own defense, fortifying its borders and avoiding any military or economic entanglement abroad. Their ranks included influential figures like Charles Lindbergh, senators, and millions of ordinary citizens who genuinely feared that aid to Britain was merely a prelude to American casualties. They warned, with sincerity, that Roosevelt was maneuvering the nation toward war. Conversely, the interventionists, organized in groups like the Committee to Defend America by Aiding the Allies, argued that the defense of Britain was the defense of America. Their conviction was simple: help the Allies fight Hitler now while they still could, or face him alone later. The national debate was a constant, searing contest in newspapers, radio broadcasts, and political rallies, a fundamental disagreement over the nation's role in the world and the meaning of its security. By late 1940, Britain was running out of money. The cash-and-carry policy, restrictive by design, had exhausted their gold reserves. Churchill wrote directly to Roosevelt, explaining that a nation could not fight a war without the means to pay for the weapons. The impending financial collapse of Britain, coupled with the continued German onslaught, demanded a solution more radical than anything that had come before. On December 29, 1940, in one of his most important fireside chats, President Roosevelt delivered a defining statement to the American people. He framed the conflict not as a foreign war, but as a direct threat to American liberty, and proposed a solution that would become the capstone of his interventionist efforts: Lend-Lease. Roosevelt famously used the analogy of a neighbor's house that catches on fire. Suppose my neighbor's home catches on fire, and I have a garden hose 400 or 500 feet away. If he can take my garden hose and connect it up with his hydrant, I may help him to put out his fire. If it is damaged, he does not have to pay me anything for the damage to the hose. The metaphor was simple, powerful, and intentionally deceptive. America would lend weapons without demanding immediate payment, effectively transferring war materiel to any nation whose defense the president deemed vital to the defense of the United States. The ensuing congressional debate over the Lend-Lease Bill, H.R. 1776, was the last great battle between isolationism and interventionism. Isolationists decried it as an act of war, arguing that lending tanks and planes was a direct military commitment. They dubbed it the Bill for Total War and the most momentous step ever taken by an American Congress. Interventionists argued that the program was in fact the only way to keep American boys out of the fighting by ensuring that Britain and the other allies had the tools to win the war themselves. On March 11, 1941, the debate concluded. The Lend-Lease Act was passed by Congress and signed into law by President Roosevelt. It was an executive triumph and a decisive turning point. The United States officially shed the pretense of strict neutrality and committed its industrial power to the Allied cause. It transformed America from a cautious spectator into the arsenal of democracy. Over the next 4 years, the U.S. would transfer over $50 billion worth of war goods to more than 40 nations, a gargantuan supply line that would sustain the global fight against the Axis. By mid-1941, American destroyers were actively escorting Lend-Lease convoys across the increasingly hostile North Atlantic, leading to undeclared naval warfare with German U-boats. American ships were being fired upon. Isolationism, once a deeply held national principle, had been compromised by the grim necessity of global events. Though Pearl Harbor was still months away, the passage of the Lend-Lease Act meant that the United States, by March 1941, was already deeply committed to the war's outcome, transforming a cautious nation's hesitation into a clear, albeit indirect, road to intervention. The question was no longer if America would fight, but when and where the inevitable blow would finally land.
A day of infamy. The attack on Pearl Harbor, December 7, 1941. The morning of December 7, 1941, broke over the Hawaiian Islands with the deceptive tranquility of a tropical Sunday. At the U.S. Naval Base in Pearl Harbor, Oahu, the air was warm, the sky clear, and the harbor waters still. To the servicemen enjoying a peaceful weekend, some sleeping late, others preparing for church, still others nearly stirring on the decks of the massive battleships, it was a routine Sabbath. The fleet, representing the concentrated power of the U.S. Pacific Navy, was arrayed like a sleeping giant, snugly moored along Battleship Row. The nation, though committed to aiding the Allies, was still technically at peace, its populace locked in a fierce, long-running debate over the merits of intervention. That debate, and the decades of isolationist foreign policy it represented, was about to be obliterated in 45 minutes of unimaginable fury. The calm before the storm, the illusion of peace. Despite the escalating tensions in the Pacific, specifically the U.S. embargoes on oil and scrap metal against Japan, following its expansionist actions in China and Indochina, American leadership, particularly in Washington, D.C., was plagued by a fundamental strategic miscalculation. While intelligence suggested a Japanese strike was imminent, the consensus was that it would be directed at European colonial possessions in Southeast Asia, the Dutch East Indies, Malaya, or the Philippines. No one in authority believed the Imperial Japanese Navy could or would dare to launch a complex, long-range attack against the heavily defended heart of American naval power. The shallow water of Pearl Harbor, it was believed, protected the battleships from torpedo attack, an assumption that would prove fatally wrong. In the hours immediately preceding the attack, minor warnings were tragically ignored or mismanaged. At 6:45 a.m., the destroyer USS Ward spotted and sank a Japanese midget submarine attempting to enter the harbor, a clear act of aggression. The report, relayed to headquarters, was taken under advisement but failed to trigger a general alarm. Later, at 7:02 a.m., a newly installed Army radar station at Opana Point detected a massive flight of aircraft approaching from the north. The inexperienced operators were told by a duty officer to disregard the sighting, believing them to be a flight of American B-17 bombers due in from the mainland. The skies were clear of enemy aircraft, officially, until the moment they weren't. The hammer blow, Wave 1. At 7:55 a.m., the first wave of 183 Japanese aircraft, Zero fighters, Val dive bombers, and Kate torpedo planes slammed into Pearl Harbor and the surrounding airfields. The attack achieved absolute strategic and psychological surprise. The first sound was not that of air raid sirens, but the terrifying roar of engines mixed with the whistle of falling bombs and the shattering impact of explosions. The Japanese pilots, led by Commander Mitsuo Fuchida, encountered virtually no resistance. Their targets were clear: the 7 battleships lined up on Battleship Row. The 8th, the USS Pennsylvania, was in dry dock, and the fighter planes parked wingtip to wingtip on the airfields. The attacks were perfectly coordinated. The torpedo planes, utilizing specially modified wooden fins that prevented their warheads from sinking into the shallow harbor floor, struck the capital ships with devastating accuracy. The immediate result was chaos and carnage. The most iconic and tragic loss was the USS Arizona. Struck by an armor-piercing bomb near its forward magazine, the ship was ripped apart by a cataclysmic internal explosion. Within 9 minutes, the Arizona was transformed into a massive funeral pyre, taking 1,177 crewmen with it to the bottom of the harbor. The battleship USS Oklahoma, hit by numerous torpedoes, immediately began to list and then capsize, trapping hundreds of men inside its hull. The USS West Virginia and California were heavily damaged and sank upright into the mud. In 15 minutes, the backbone of the Pacific Fleet had been broken. Meanwhile, Japanese planes decimated the nearby airfields, particularly Wheeler and Hickam fields. American aircraft were caught on the ground, lined up to simplify guarding against sabotage, a fatal decision in the face of an air attack. The vast majority of the Army Air Corps and Navy planes were destroyed before they could even get airborne, ensuring Japanese air superiority for the duration of the assault.
Resilience amidst the ruin. The American counter-reaction. Despite the paralyzing shock, acts of incredible heroism and defiance emerged instantly. The Japanese had anticipated mass panic, but they met only the confusion of the unprepared, followed by the fierce, instinctual determination of trained fighting men. Sailors and Marines manned anti-aircraft guns with minimal ammunition, often scrambling to load and fire on their own initiative. The commander of the West Virginia, Captain Mervyn Benyon, received a fatal wound but continued to issue orders until he died. Messman Doris Dory Miller, an African-American sailor restricted to non-combat duties, grabbed a .50 caliber machine gun he had never been trained to use and shot down several enemy aircraft, saving the lives of several shipmates before helping his wounded captain. His actions would later earn him the Navy Cross, making him a symbol of courage that defied the military's racial segregation policies. The battle for damage control began instantly. Engineers aboard the heavily damaged USS Nevada, recognizing they could not save the ship, courageously managed to get it underway, attempting to beach it to prevent the battleship from sinking in the channel mouth, where it would have blocked all traffic. This act was performed under continuous aerial assault. Throughout the morning, ordinary sailors became firefighters, medics, and rescuers, driven by adrenaline and a primal fury at the treachery of the attack. The second wave and the aftermath. At 8:54 a.m., the second, smaller wave of 171 Japanese aircraft arrived. This wave focused on finishing off the cripples, bombing the dry docks, and striking the shore installations. The intensity of anti-aircraft fire had significantly increased as men had finally reached their battle stations, loaded guns, and began coordinating their defense. The second wave met stiffer resistance, and the Japanese pilots, having achieved their primary objective, began to withdraw by 9:45 a.m. When the smoke cleared, the grim statistics told a devastating story. 2,403 Americans were killed, including 68 civilians, and 1,178 were wounded. 8 battleships were damaged, with 4 sunk: USS Arizona, Oklahoma, Utah, and California, although the latter 2 were later raised and repaired. 3 cruisers, 3 destroyers, and 3 auxiliary ships were either sunk or damaged. 188 aircraft were destroyed, and 159 were damaged. Crucially, however, 3 vital assets were elsewhere. The Pacific Fleet's 3 aircraft carriers, USS Enterprise, Lexington, and Saratoga, were out at sea on maneuvers or delivery missions and were not in the harbor. The Japanese had committed a fatal strategic error by focusing solely on the battleships, which were quickly becoming obsolete in the era of naval air power. They failed to strike the vital shoreside maintenance facilities, the oil storage tanks, and the submarine base, all of which were critical for a prolonged war effort. This oversight meant the U.S. could quickly reconstitute its strength. The political earthquake, the end of isolationism. The news of the attack arrived in Washington, D.C. in piecemeal, horrifying fragments throughout the early afternoon. President Roosevelt, meeting with his advisors, received the confirmation that the attack was real, massive, and entirely unprovoked. The sudden, brutal surprise accomplished what years of lobbying, warnings, and diplomacy could not. It instantly and irrevocably ended the era of isolationism. The fierce domestic debate between isolationists and interventionists evaporated in the flash and fire of the attack. America First dissolved immediately,
its mission was rendered instantly obsolete. The nation was united, galvanized by shock, rage, and a profound sense of vengeance. The memory of the innocent Sunday morning turned to bloody chaos, transformed the political landscape overnight. On December 8, 1941, President Roosevelt appeared before a joint session of Congress. The atmosphere in the Capitol was solemn, hushed, and charged with palpable emotion. The president delivered one of the most famous speeches in American history, an address of just over 6 minutes, requesting a formal declaration of war. He began with the sentence that would forever define the event. Yesterday, December 7th, 1941, a date which will live in infamy, the United States of America was suddenly and deliberately attacked by naval and air forces of the Empire of Japan. Roosevelt laid out the facts, painting the attack as a cynical, premeditated act of treachery committed while Japanese envoys were still negotiating peace in Washington. His speech was not a philosophical argument about defending democracy. It was a simple, righteous demand for retribution. The response was overwhelming. Congress, the body that had spent years meticulously drafting laws to prevent American entry into the war, voted for a declaration of war against Japan with near unanimity. The tally was 411-0 in the House and 82-0 in the Senate, with only a single pacifist member, Representative Jeanette Rankin of Montana, casting a dissenting vote. Rankin, who had also voted against U.S. entry into World War I, later explained, "As a woman, I can't go to war, and I refuse to send anyone else." She was swiftly condemned by the press and the public. The third day, the second shoe dropped. Germany and Italy, bound by treaty to Japan, declared war on the United States on December 11, 1941. Without hesitation, the U.S. Congress reciprocated, and America was formally engaged in a global two-front war against the Axis powers, Japan, Germany, and Italy. The call to arms, a nation reborn. Pearl Harbor did more than just unify the country. It spurred a massive, unparalleled mobilization effort. The question of whether to fight was settled. Now the only question was how to fight. The entire industrial and human infrastructure of the United States shifted gears violently. The shame of being caught unprepared, the searing imagery of the sinking battleships, and the solemn cessation of the national funeral for the dead instilled a profound collective resolve. The immediate priorities were clear: recruitment and conscription. Millions of young men who had previously watched the war from afar now rushed to enlist. The existing draft system was rapidly accelerated to build the required force of millions needed to fight in both the European and Pacific theaters. Industrial conversion. Factories that had once made automobiles and refrigerators instantly began the expensive, difficult transition to war production. This shift, the heart of the arsenal of democracy concept, was now a matter of national survival. The year 1941 closed with the United States in a state of utter shock, yet infused with furious energy. The attack on Pearl Harbor was a moment of supreme national vulnerability, a painful and humiliating failure of military preparedness and political foresight. But it was also the indispensable spark. It transformed a nation of hesitant, isolationist onlookers into a united, vengeful, and determined global combatant. The Day of Infamy secured the immediate future of the Allied cause. It brought the industrial and human might of the world's largest economy fully into the war, ensuring that American power would now be brought to bear with relentless focus on both the Nazi regime in Europe and the Empire of Japan in the Pacific. The die was cast. The great American war saga, from the docks of Pearl Harbor to the final bloody theaters of conflict, had begun.
The declaration of war was a necessary beginning, but it was merely a promise of future action. For America to become the arsenal of democracy that President Roosevelt had envisioned, the nation had to undergo a transformation more profound and rapid than any industrial effort in human history. The energy unleashed by the shock of Pearl Harbor was channeled not just into recruitment centers, but into the factories, farms, and scientific laboratories of the nation. The period from late 1941 through 1945 saw the home front revolution, a complete restructuring of the American economy and society that finally crushed the lingering depression and forged the material might required to win a two-front war. The conversion from cars to carriers. For a decade, the Great Depression had paralyzed the American industrial engine, leaving millions unemployed and factories idle. In the weeks and months following Pearl Harbor, that paralysis gave way to a whirlwind of organized chaos. The mandate was clear, delivered by Roosevelt: we must outproduce the Axis. The colossal undertaking was overseen by the War Production Board, WPB, a bureaucratic leviathan created to manage the allocation of scarce resources and dictate the pace of manufacturing. The most visible symbol of this radical shift was the sudden, total cessation of civilian production. In February 1942, the last civilian car rolled off the assembly line. From that moment, the entire colossal machinery of Detroit, Ford, General Motors, Chrysler, was devoted solely to military hardware. The figures beggar belief. Henry Ford's revolutionary Willow Run plant, built near Detroit, became a modern miracle, a sprawling monument to American mass production. Designed to build the B-24 Liberator bomber, Willow Run employed over 40,000 workers and eventually produced a bomber an hour by 1944. General Motors built a vast array of equipment, from tanks and aircraft engines to guns and ammunition. The automotive industry, the symbol of American freedom in peacetime, became the forge of American power in war, ultimately contributing nearly 1/5 of all U.S. war production. The need for a navy to fight the war in the Pacific demanded a parallel revolution in shipbuilding. Entrepreneurial genius Henry J. Kaiser became the personification of this speed and scale. Utilizing mass production techniques and prefabricated sections, Kaiser's shipyards, scattered from California to Portland, slashed the time required to build the workhorse of the Atlantic convoys, the Liberty ship. What once took months now took mere weeks. One shipyard famously built the Liberty ship in just over 4 days as a publicity stunt. Though its utility was questionable, the point was made: American industry could perform miracles. This industrial mobilization was a relentless, 24-hour, 7-day-a-week effort. Coal mines, steel mills, rubber factories, and aluminum smelters roared back to life and then pushed past their historical limits. The goal was not incremental improvement, it was exponential growth. The WPB's mantra was to maximize output regardless of cost, quality, or environmental impact. In 1944 alone, the United States produced 96,000 aircraft, 65,000 tanks, and 1.2 million trucks. This overwhelming tide of steel, as Stalin would later call it, proved to be the ultimate strategic weapon of the war. The end of the Great Depression. The primary domestic consequence of this mobilization was nothing less than the instantaneous death of the Great Depression. The demands of total war created a desperate need for labor, both skilled and unskilled. The approximately 10 million unemployed Americans, a lingering crisis that had plagued the nation for a decade, were suddenly absorbed into the burgeoning war economy. Unemployment plummeted from nearly 15% in 1940 to around 1.2% in 1944, a level widely considered to be overemployment. Factories, shipyards, and munitions plants no longer were struggling to find buyers, they were struggling to find enough workers. This unprecedented demand for labor drove wages up and provided financial stability to families that had known nothing but hardship since 1929. Millions left the hard-hit farms and the rural South, migrating to industrial centers like Detroit, Chicago, Los Angeles, and the burgeoning Pacific Northwest to take on high-paying defense jobs. The economic stimulus provided by massive government spending, all funded by war bonds and taxes, finally provided the financial engine that the New Deal had sought for years. The war lifted Americans out of poverty by giving them the jobs and the purpose they desperately craved.
Women on the March. The rise of Rosie the Riveter. The single greatest demographic transformation of the labor force was the mass entry of women into industrial work. With millions of young men enlisting, the vacant positions in the factories had to be filled. The government and industry launched an intense propaganda campaign featuring the iconic image of Rosie the Riveter, strong, capable, and patriotic, to encourage women to take up what had historically been considered men's work. Nearly 6 million women entered the workforce during the war, many taking jobs in heavy industry. They became riveters in aircraft plants, welders in shipyards, bus drivers, and munitions workers. They built the planes that bombed Berlin and the ships that sailed the Pacific. This was not a purely white movement. The number of African American women in industrial jobs increased threefold. This experience fundamentally changed American society. It demonstrated to both men and women themselves that women were fully capable of performing demanding industrial and technical labor. The wages they earned provided an economic independence and social confidence previously unknown to most women, challenging traditional gender roles and setting the stage for future civil rights movements. Although many of these women were forced out of their jobs when the men returned in 1945, the experience proved a permanent shift in the American understanding of female capabilities. The new Great Migration and racial tensions. The wartime economic boom also spurred the second Great Migration, as over 2 million African Americans left the rural South for industrial jobs in northern and western cities. This migration, however, brought severe social tension. In cities like Detroit and Los Angeles, the sudden influx of black and white migrants competing for limited housing, transit, and recreational space ignited racial conflict. The most notable flashpoint occurred in Detroit in June 1943, where a simmering dispute over job competition and housing exploded into 3 days of deadly rioting, requiring federal troops to restore order. Despite this, the war was a pivotal moment for the civil rights movement. Black leaders demanding equality in the fight against fascism abroad campaigned for the Double V campaign, victory over the Axis abroad and victory over discrimination at home. President Roosevelt was forced to respond to the pressure. In 1941, activist A. Philip Randolph planned a massive march on Washington to protest racial discrimination in the defense industry. To prevent the embarrassing protest, Roosevelt issued Executive Order 8802, which banned discrimination in the federal government and defense industries based on race, creed, color, or national origin, and established the Fair Employment Practices Committee, FEPC. Though compliance was patchy, this was the first significant federal action taken to ensure equal employment opportunity since Reconstruction. Austerity and sacrifice. The Civilian War. The home front revolution was also a revolution in austerity. Everything from gasoline and tires to meat, sugar, and shoes was diverted to the war effort, necessitating widespread rationing. The government issued ration books containing stamps that consumers needed to purchase scarce goods. Long lines at grocery stores became a daily reality, and hoarding was viewed as a deeply unpatriotic act. To support the troops and demonstrate patriotism, Americans were encouraged to embrace sacrifice. Victory gardens flourished in backyards and parks, generating nearly half of the country's vegetable supply. Scrap drives collected everything from rubber and aluminum to paper and cooking grease, turning ordinary household waste into raw materials for the war machine. This collective sacrifice was a source of great national unity and civic pride, making every citizen feel like a vital participant in the war effort.
Finally, the immense cost of the war was financed through taxation and war bonds. The government significantly expanded the income tax base, making it a mass levy for the first time in history. Simultaneously, massive, highly successful war bond campaigns mobilized popular culture and Hollywood to encourage Americans to loan their money to the government. These campaigns were not just about finance, they were a means of psychological engagement, giving citizens a financial and moral stake in the success of the war. The home front revolution was a period of breathtaking speed, massive scale, and profound change. It transformed the defeated Depression-era nation into an industrial superpower capable of deploying staggering resources across 2 oceans. This mobilization was the true, silent victory of the early war years, securing the means by which American boys, trained and equipped in the factories of the Revolution, would ultimately win the global conflict. The United States was no longer simply lending its industrial power, it was wielding it.
The transformation of the United States in 1942 was not merely a mobilization of people, but a monumental mobilization of metal, machinery, and mind. The country that had once struggled to sell bread during the Depression now found itself in the business of saving civilization. And it did so by unleashing an industrial force the world had never conceived. This was the moment the arsenal of democracy, President Franklin Roosevelt's defining phrase, ceased to be a metaphor and became a terrifying, undeniable reality. American manufacturing might, powered by the sheer scale of its production, became the decisive strategic weapon of World War II. Overwhelming the Axis powers with a relentless, inescapable tide of material goods. The assembly line goes to war, the triumph of mass production. The foundation of this industrial miracle was the very thing that defined America in the 20th century, the assembly line. While Germany and Japan possessed superior initial weaponry and highly motivated professional armies, their industrial infrastructure was fragmented, relying on skilled craftsmanship and small-batch production. The United States, by contrast, had perfected the art of mass production and interchangeable parts, an economy of scale built by automotive giants like Ford and General Motors. When the war began, Detroit ceased to be the Motor City and became the War City, executing the single greatest industrial conversion in history. The sheer audacity of the government's production goals was staggering. After Pearl Harbor, Roosevelt called for the production of 60,000 planes in 1942 and 125,000 in 1943. These numbers were deemed impossible by most military analysts, yet American industry absorbed the challenge. Companies like Ford, accustomed to building millions of identical cars, now applied the same rigorous principles to tanks, jeeps, and aircraft. The epitome of this transformation was the legendary Willow Run bomber plant in Ypsilanti, Michigan. Conceived by Henry Ford, this colossal factory, spanning 67 acres under one roof, was designed to manufacture the heavy B-24 Liberator bomber as if it were a Model T. In its first months, production was sluggish due to complex logistical and labor issues. But by 1944, Ford's engineering genius prevailed. The line stretched over a mile long, feeding components into the final assembly point. Willow Run achieved the unthinkable, delivering a complete B-24 bomber every 63 minutes, producing nearly 9,000 of the aircraft by the war's end. This single plant outproduced the entire German aircraft industry's heavy bomber output for the duration of the war. This efficiency extended across the industrial landscape. Chrysler built tanks faster than they could be deployed, manufacturing the backbone of the Allied armored divisions, the M4 Sherman tank. General Motors' contribution was vast and varied,
ranging from the crucial GMC CCKW deuce-and-a-half truck, the workhorse of Allied logistics, to precision aircraft engines and machine guns. The principle was simple. If a machine could make something once, it could be retooled and simplified to make it 1,000,000 times. The American genius was not in inventing new weapons, but in producing an overwhelming quantity of reliable weapons faster than the enemy could destroy them. This colossal production capability served not only American troops, but also sustained the Soviet and British war efforts through the arteries of Lend-Lease. The Shipbuilding Blitz, the miracle of Henry J. Kaiser. The scale of the war required not only weapons, but the ships to deliver them across two vast, dangerous oceans. German U-boats were sinking Allied merchant ships faster than Britain could replace them, threatening to starve the island nation and sever the lifeline to the European front. The United States needed to produce a massive fleet, and fast. The man who solved this impossible logistical puzzle was Henry J. Kaiser, a civilian industrialist with no previous experience in shipbuilding. Kaiser's genius lay in his willingness to abandon centuries of tradition and apply automotive assembly line techniques to the construction of ocean-going vessels. Instead of building a ship in one location from start to finish, Kaiser pioneered prefabrication. Sections of the ship, the hull, bulkheads, decks, were manufactured in separate workshops, often miles apart, and then welded together in the dry dock. This required replacing the traditional rivet with the far faster and more efficient electric arc weld, transforming the shipyard environment. The result was the Liberty ship, a simple, modular cargo vessel of around 10,000 deadweight tons. They were slow, boxy, and ugly, but critically, they were easy and fast to build. Before the war, it took almost a year to build a similar freighter. Kaiser's yards dramatically reduced that time. In 1941, the average build time was 240 days. In 1942, it dropped to 42 days. In 1943, the Robert E. Peary was famously completed, start to finish, in 4 days and 15 hours. Though this was non-replicable effort, it demonstrated the potential. Kaiser's yards employed thousands of new workers, including many women and minorities, in massive 24-hour operations stretching along the West Coast. By the end of the war, American yards had produced nearly 5,700 merchant ships, including 2,710 Liberty ships. This staggering output drowned the German U-boat threat. For every ship the German subs sank, American yards launched 2, 3, or 4 in response. It was a war of attrition that the Axis could not possibly win, simply because they could not match the American capacity to replace losses. The Sky Dominators, Aircraft Production and Design. The air war over Europe and the Pacific demanded not only quantity, but also quality in aircraft design. The American effort blended industrial might with continuous design improvement, producing some of the most iconic and successful military planes in history. Bombers were the spearhead of the strategic war against Germany. The Boeing B-17 Fortress and B-24 Liberator formed the backbone of the 8th Air Force's devastating daylight bombing campaign. Their robust, durable designs allowed them to absorb tremendous damage and still return their crews home. Later in the Pacific, the massive B-29 Superfortress entered service. Designed to fly higher, faster, and farther than any bomber before it, the B-29 was primarily an industrial marvel. Its production required entirely new assembly plants and highly coordinated national parts production, ultimately proving to be the platform for the war's final technological leap. In the realm of fighters, American innovation proved equally crucial. While initially relying on capable but outclassed models like the P-40 Warhawk, the U.S. soon introduced game changers. Grumman F-6F Hellcat. Developed in response to the superior Japanese Zero, the Hellcat was rugged, powerful, and easy for new pilots to fly.
Its sheer numbers and superior durability gave U.S. Navy pilots a decisive edge in the Pacific skies. In North American P-51 Mustang, perhaps the greatest fighter of the war, the Mustang combined an incredibly sleek airframe with a powerful British-designed Rolls-Royce Merlin engine manufactured in the U.S. by Packard. Its astonishing range allowed it to escort American heavy bombers deep into Germany and back, neutralizing the Luftwaffe and giving the Allies undisputed air supremacy over Europe. The Mustang, delivered in vast quantities, directly facilitated the success of D-Day by ensuring the German air resistance was negligible. The combined output was overwhelming. While the Axis economies were constantly straining and collapsing under the weight of Allied bombing and supply shortages, the American production line hummed uninterrupted. By 1945, the U.S. had produced close to 300,000 military aircraft, dwarfing the combined production of all its enemies.
The Secret War: Key Technological Leaps. The American military machine was powered not just by sheer volume, but by a quiet, parallel effort in research and development that created a vital technological edge. This secret war of scientists and engineers proved as critical to victory as any battle won by soldiers. 1. Radar and sonar. The Battle of the Atlantic was won not just by Liberty ships, but by radar. American and British scientists rapidly perfected microwave radar technology, which allowed Allied aircraft and ships to detect submerged German U-boats even in complete darkness or fog. This innovation turned the tide of the submarine war, making it nearly impossible for German U-boats to operate undetected. Similarly, improved sonar technology drastically increased the effectiveness of Allied destroyers hunting U-boats, forcing the German fleet to retreat from the Atlantic supply lanes. 2. The proximity fuse, the secret weapon. Perhaps the most critical yet unsung technological innovation was the variable time proximity fuse, a complex miniature radar set embedded in the nose of an artillery shell. This device allowed the shell to explode automatically when it came near its target, ship, aircraft, or ground troops, rather than relying on a direct hit or a timed fuse. In the naval war, it instantly made anti-aircraft fire hundreds of times more effective, shooting down Japanese planes at an accelerated rate. During the Battle of the Bulge in late 1944, the proximity fuse was cleared for use against German ground troops. Its terrifying effectiveness, exploding in the air above foxholes and delivering shrapnel over a wide area, was so devastating that General George S. Patton credited it with single-handedly winning the battle. The fuse was a true secret weapon, feared by the enemy and carefully guarded by the Allies. 3. Penicillin and medicine. On the medical front, American mass production techniques were applied to the newly discovered penicillin. Prior to the war, penicillin was a laboratory curiosity, produced in minuscule, ineffective quantities. American pharmaceutical firms adapted deep tank fermentation methods to produce the drug on an industrial scale. This medical miracle drastically reduced the mortality rate from battlefield infections and pneumonia, saving countless lives and fundamentally altering the landscape of modern medicine forever. The ultimate secret: the Manhattan Project. All of these innovations, the ships, the planes, the fuses, the medicines, were dwarfed by the ultimate technological gamble: the Manhattan Project. Recognizing the terrifying theoretical possibility of the Germans developing an atomic weapon, President Roosevelt in 1942 authorized a top-secret, unprecedented effort to harness nuclear fission. Led by physicist Robert Oppenheimer and General Leslie Groves, the project involved hundreds of thousands of workers, billions of dollars, a staggering sum at the time, and the construction of entire secret cities like Oak Ridge, Tennessee, and Hanford, Washington. The Manhattan Project was the convergence of American scientific genius, industrial capacity, and managerial rootlessness. It was a race against time, a colossal undertaking to build a weapon that was only theorized to exist. Its success, which remained a secret even from Vice President Harry T. Truman until Roosevelt's death, would eventually provide the war's sudden, devastating finale. The unending tide. In the end, the Axis powers were not simply defeated by superior tactics or better soldiers. They were crushed by industrial capacity. The commitment to the arsenal of democracy proved to be the most critical strategic decision of the war. Germany and Japan entered the conflict with a technological head start, but an inability to scale. They were fighting a war of diminishing returns. The United States, by contrast, entered the war with a production capacity that was, by some measures, greater than all the Axis nations combined, and it continuously increased that output until the final day of the war. This unending tide of American steel, the tanks that shattered the German counteroffensive, the planes that blanketed Europe, and the ships that bridged the oceans was the ultimate defining factor in the Allied victory. The home front revolution had delivered the instruments of war, forging a nation that was no longer hesitant, but fully armed and ready to fight on the world stage.
The fires of Pearl Harbor did not merely incinerate a fleet, they incinerated a national mindset. The cozy, insular fantasy of American isolation died in the Pacific mud, replaced by a cold, hard, and urgent requirement, the need for an army. For a nation that had successfully resisted entanglement in the European war for years, the transition from peace to total war required a wholesale manufacturing effort applied not to steel and ships, but to human beings. The machinery of conscription, long dormant and politically contentious, roared to life, churning out the 12 million citizen soldiers who would ultimately be known as the Greatest Generation. This revolution in manpower was administered through the unyielding mechanism of the Selective Service Act. In the weeks following December 7, 1941, the Act, initially conceived as a cautious peacetime measure in 1940, was radically expanded. The pool of eligible men ballooned to include all males aged 18 to 64, with those between 20 and 45 liable for service. The system was centralized, standardized, and mercilessly efficient, reaching into every small town and major city. The local draft board, once a quiet office processing bureaucratic paperwork, became the fulcrum of destiny, the place where the path of individual life was irrevocably diverted into the chaotic stream of global conflict. The moment of reckoning from civilian to soldier. For the young men who received that fateful letter, the official notice beginning with the impersonal address, "Greetings from the President," the draft was both a patriotic summons and a terrifying personal disruption. The process began with the registration lottery, a moment of national suspense captured by radio broadcasts. Numbers were pulled, fates were sealed. Those who drew low numbers found their lives immediately accelerating towards war. The journey began at the induction center. Here the draftees gathered, farmers from the plains, factory workers from Detroit, clerks from Wall Street, and students yanked from college campuses. They stood side by side in their last moments of civilian identity, bound by a shared nervous silence. The first step was the physical exam, a humiliating, rushed process, often described with dark humor. Doctors, checking off dozens of boxes under intense pressure, determined who was fit for the unforgiving rigors of combat. A failing eye or a weak heart earned a man the coveted 4F deferment. A healthy body earned him a 1A and the certainty of deployment. Once accepted, the man was stripped of his clothes, his name, and his haircut. The issued uniform was coarse wool and often ill-fitting, symbolizing the collective identity being forced upon the individual. He was given a serial number, a designation that replaced his name in the eyes of the Army, Navy, or Marines. The psychological transition was immediate and brutal. Personal desires, ambitions, and fears were subsumed into the singular purpose of winning the war. They were no longer individuals, they were fungible assets in a massive global operation. The sheer volume of men processed was unprecedented. Over 10 million men were funneled through the draft pipeline, joining the 6 million-plus volunteers who answered the initial call. This colossal flow was a logistical nightmare that forced the immediate, rapid construction of the infrastructure needed to house, feed, and train them. Building the barracks, the infrastructure boom. The pre-war military facilities were utterly inadequate for the demands of a multi-million-man army. The War Department was forced to launch a massive emergency construction project, establishing dozens of colossal new training camps, often in remote, sparsely populated areas, chosen for their climate and ample space for maneuvers. Across the sun-baked deserts of the Southwest and the humid plains of the Southeast, instant cities sprang up. Fort Benning in Georgia became the center of infantry and airborne training. Camp Shelby in Mississippi and Camp Hood in Texas swelled from quiet reserves to bustling metropolises of wood and tar paper barracks. These camps were characterized by their temporary nature, hastily constructed wooden buildings, primitive sanitation, and vast, dusty drill fields. Life in these cantonments was a study of contrasts. The barracks were crowded, the food often monotonous, and the training schedule relentless. Yet these camps, born of necessity, served as the ultimate leveling agent. A wealthy Yale student found himself scrubbing latrines alongside a penniless sharecropper from Alabama. Regional accents, class distinctions, and previous civilian status all melted away in the shared misery of a forced march or the biting tongue of a drill sergeant. The early days of mobilization were plagued by a critical shortage of equipment, a paradoxical reality given the simultaneous push for the arsenal of democracy. While Henry J. Kaiser was rushing to build Liberty ships, soldiers in training often had to make do with simulated weapons. Photos from 1942 show men drilling with wooden rifles, sometimes actual sticks carved into the rough shape of the M1 Garand, and tanks represented by trucks with painted armor plating. This improvised training underscored the terrifying gap between American readiness and the reality of a world already at war. The soldiers knew they were training for real battles, but for a period they lacked the real tools. It was an exercise in faith as much as physical conditioning. The crucible, basic training, and the drill sergeant. The core of the military transformation took place in basic training, the crucible designed to strip away civilian habits and instill the reflexes of a soldier. This high-pressure 12 to 17-week process was managed by the omnipresent, often tyrannical figure of the drill sergeant. The drill sergeant was the non-commissioned officer who held absolute, terrifying authority. Their methods were often psychological and physical shock therapy, designed not for comfort, but for survival. Every action, from making a bed, called making a rack, to marching, was timed, scrutinized, and demanded absolute, instantaneous obedience. The constant verbal assault and relentless pace were deliberate. In the midst of combat confusion, the soldier could not pause and think. They had to react by instinct, and that instinct had to be to follow orders and perform their duty. Training was physically brutal. Soldiers endured grueling forced marches, or hikes, with heavy packs, often covering 20 miles in extreme heat or cold. They were subjected to punishing obstacle courses, pushing their bodies past self-imposed limits. This conditioning was essential to ensure a man could sustain himself in prolonged combat environments, whether in the malaria-ridden jungles of the Pacific or the snowbound forests of the Ardennes. The mastery of weaponry was paramount. The M1 Garand rifle, the semi-automatic standard-issue weapon of the U.S. Army, was held in almost religious reverence. Every recruit spent countless hours on the firing range, drilling until cleaning and firing the weapon was muscle memory. Live fire exercises were designed to mimic the sheer shock of battle. Recruits crawled under barbed wire while machine guns fired real rounds just inches overhead. The purpose was to accustom the men to the sound of violence, to teach them to stay low, and to ensure that fear, when it came, would be managed by training. The officer class, 90-day wonders. The rapid expansion of the enlisted ranks created an immediate desperate shortage of field-grade and company officers. To fill this gap, the Officer Candidate Schools, or OCS, operated at maximum capacity, often taking the brightest, best educated, and most promising enlisted men and accelerating their leadership training. These graduates, often affectionately or sarcastically called 90-day wonders, were remarkably young and rapidly promoted. They were thrust into command with fresh knowledge but little experience, forced to lead men only a few months younger than themselves into battle. This dynamic created a distinctly American, informal officer corps, less concerned with rigid class hierarchy than with pragmatic problem-solving, a style that often clashed with the rigid traditions of European militaries, but proved highly effective on the battlefield. The weight of responsibility on these young lieutenants and captains was immense, often leading to rapid burnout or, tragically, death in action. The unseen army, women and minorities. The total mobilization of the nation required tapping into previously restricted pools of talent, leading to irreversible social changes within the military structure itself. Women in uniform. With millions of men deployed overseas, a massive logistical and administrative gap opened on the home front. Women stepped into this void, not just in factories, but in uniform. The creation of the Women's Army Corps, or WACS, the Women Accepted for Volunteer Emergency Service, or WAVES, of the Navy, and the Women Air Force Service Pilots, or WASPs, was a revolutionary moment. Women took on non-combat roles vital to the war effort, decoding enemy messages, maintaining aircraft, driving heavy vehicles, and managing the colossal paperwork of an army of 12 million. The WASPs, though civilians, flew every type of military aircraft, from factories to deployment airfields, freeing up thousands of male pilots for combat. Their service shattered entrenched cultural norms, proving beyond doubt the capability and dedication of American women to military service, even as they faced skepticism and institutional resistance. The segregated war. For African Americans, the war presented a painful paradox, fighting for democracy abroad while enduring systematic segregation at home and within the armed forces. Despite discriminatory practices, over 1 million African Americans served. They were often relegated to segregated units, mainly in support roles like transportation, logistics, and supply. Yet, their contributions were vital and often heroic. The Tuskegee Airmen, a segregated unit of fighter pilots trained in Alabama, became one of the most highly decorated groups in the war, building a reputation for never losing a bomber under their escort. Their service, alongside other units like the tank battalions of the 761st, powerfully underscored the moral necessity of racial integration and laid a powerful foundation for the post-war civil rights movement. The demand for the double V, victory over the Axis and victory over racism at home, became a defining cause of the era. Other minority groups served with distinction in unique roles. Thousands of Native Americans, particularly Navajo, Comanche, and Cherokee, served as code talkers in the Pacific and European theaters. Their native languages, complex and known only by a handful of anthropologists, became unbreakable military codes, proving invaluable in transmitting critical, instantaneous orders during key battles like Iwo Jima and Guadalcanal. The war was, in its own brutal way, the ultimate engine of multicultural integration. The American ideal, forging unity. The military draft was perhaps the greatest socializing force in American history. It deliberately mixed people from every background: Irish immigrants from Boston, Italian families from New Jersey, Texan ranchers, and Midwestern farm boys. The shared hardships of basic training, the common enemy, and the realization that their survival depended on the man next to them, regardless of his background, slowly dissolved the isolationist regional and class divisions that had defined the Depression era. The purpose of the draft was not merely to assemble a large army, but to forge a national consensus and a singular identity. By 1943, this force, this vast, diverse, and suddenly professional army was ready. 12 million Americans had been processed, trained, equipped, and sent into harm's way. They were the tangible proof that the arsenal of democracy was not just about making bombs and planes. It was about mobilizing the vast human capital of the United States. The hesitant nation of 1939 was gone. In its place stood a military colossus, manned by a generation that had found its collective purpose in the face of tyranny. The stage was set, the armies were mobilized, and the next phase of the war, the global deployment and the first bloody confrontations with the Axis, was about to begin.
Their relationship, managed through frequent personal meetings like Casablanca, Quebec, and Tehran, and thousands of telegrams, was marked by deep mutual respect, essential trust, and perpetual, often heated disagreement. Their bond transcended diplomacy. It was the essential human foundation of the entire alliance, preventing it from fracturing under the immense stress of conflicting national interests and strategic doctrines. One early result of this partnership was the agreement, reached at the Casablanca Conference in January 1943, to demand unconditional surrender from the Axis powers. This decree, driven largely by Roosevelt, and intended to reassure the Soviet Union that the Western Allies would not seek a separate peace, unified the Allied war aims. It meant the fighting would continue until the regimes of Hitler, Mussolini, and Tojo were utterly destroyed, providing a relentless clarity of purpose that motivated the American war effort until VE and VJ days. The Unified Command, the Combined Chiefs of Staff. Perhaps the most revolutionary aspect of the Allied strategy was the creation of a truly unified, interlocking military command structure. Historically, alliances were plagued by poor coordination, rivalry, and national self-interest. To avoid this, Roosevelt and Churchill established the Combined Chiefs of Staff, or CCS. The CCS was composed of the heads of the American Armed Forces, General George C. Marshall, Chief of Staff of the Army, Admiral Ernest J. King, Chief of Naval Operations, and General Henry H. Hap Arnold, Chief of the Army Air Forces, meeting directly with their British counterparts, Field Marshal Sir Alan Brooke, Chief of the Imperial General Staff, Admiral of the Fleet Sir Dudley Pound, and Marshal of the Royal Air Force Sir Charles Portal. The CCS met constantly in Washington, D.C., operating not as delegates of separate nations, but as a single, combined entity dedicated to allocating the total resources of the two nations against the Axis. This body made every major strategic decision: resource allocation, determining whether tanks went to the Soviet Union via the Arctic or to North Africa via the Atlantic; operational planning, drawing up the blueprints for Operation Overlord, D-Day, and the campaigns in the Mediterranean; appointments, deciding who would command combined operations, for example, placing the American General Dwight D. Eisenhower in command of European operations, a decision symbolizing the shift of power to the U.S. The success of the CCS was largely attributable to the relationship between the two key military leaders, Marshall and Brooke. General George C. Marshall, the American Army Chief of Staff,
was the architect of the U.S. mobilization. A man of quiet, intense competence and singular vision, Marshall possessed the managerial genius to build the 12-million-man army and the industry that supplied it. His influence was so profound that Churchill called him the true organizer of victory. Field Marshal Brooke, Marshall's British counterpart, was a brilliant, sharp-tongued strategist who often served as the skeptical foil to Marshall's sometimes overly aggressive plans, forcing the Americans to consider the logistical realities of their proposals. The creation of the CCS, a permanent supranational military headquarters, was an unprecedented commitment to collective security. It meant that American soldiers often fought under British command, and British forces frequently operated under American direction, a degree of integration never before achieved in a war between allied, sovereign powers. The Second Front debate, the clash of strategic philosophies. From 1942 onward, the Europe First strategy became dominated by the fierce, continuous debate about the Second Front, when and where to launch a major invasion of Nazi-occupied Western Europe to relieve pressure on the Soviets. The American doctrine, direct action. General Marshall and the American planners were deeply concerned about the sheer scale of Soviet losses and the possibility of a Soviet collapse. Their doctrine favored the shortest path to victory, which meant a massive, direct, cross-channel invasion of France, Operation Roundup, to be launched as early as possible, certainly in 1943. The American argument was simple. The main body of the German army was in the east. To defeat Germany, the Allies must engage the main German army. An invasion of France would force Hitler to withdraw divisions from the Eastern Front, giving the Soviets the necessary breathing room and leading to a quick, decisive conclusion to the war. Marshall pressed this plan relentlessly throughout 1942, viewing any diversion as a dangerous waste of precious resources and time. The British doctrine, peripheral strategy. Churchill and General Brooke were scarred by the disastrous Gallipoli campaign in World War I and the bloody trench warfare. They were highly skeptical of a direct assault before all possible resources were amassed. Their proposal was Operation Torch, an invasion of North Africa. The British argument was twofold. Immediate action. It would get American troops into action against German forces in 1942, satisfying the public and political need for offensive action while giving the green American forces necessary combat experience. And strategic gains. Success in North Africa would secure the Mediterranean, open supply lines to the east, and set the stage for attacking the Italian mainland, knocking Italy out of the war. They argued this would divert German resources without the catastrophic risk of a premature cross-channel invasion. The debate was acrimonious. Marshall saw Torch as a British-centric diversion that would delay the decisive French invasion Roundup by at least a year. Brooke saw Roundup as potential suicide. The fate of the 1943 European campaign hung in the balance. The decision for Torch. Ultimately, President Roosevelt sided with Churchill. While Marshall's plan was strategically sound in theory, the political reality of 1942 dictated action. The American public and press were demanding to see U.S. troops fighting the Germans immediately. Furthermore, Roosevelt was politically committed to supporting Churchill's position, as the British had sustained the war effort alone for over 2 years. In July 1942, Roosevelt gave the definitive order. Operation Torch would proceed in November. The decision infuriated Marshall and required intense effort to soothe the Soviet Union, which felt betrayed by the continued delay of the promised Second Front. Yet the decision proved essential. It committed vast American resources to the European, African, Mediterranean Theater, ETO, rapidly professionalizing the raw American divisions and setting the stage for the later, more massive invasions of Sicily and Italy. The logistics of the Atlantic Bridge, Operation Bolero. The Europe First strategy required an almost unimaginable logistical effort known as Operation Bolero. This was the plan to stage the entire American invasion force, millions of tons of equipment, and over 1.5 million men in Great Britain, turning the island into a massive forward operating base and a colossal aircraft carrier. Bolero was dependent on victory in the Battle of the Atlantic. The supply lines across the Atlantic were the lifeblood of the entire strategy, and they were constantly menaced by German U-boats. The American production from the arsenal of democracy meant nothing if the material sank to the bottom of the ocean. Therefore, the first battle of Europe First was the fight to secure the sea lanes. The convoy system? Massive convoys protected by newly built American destroyers and escort carriers carried vital supplies. Technological supremacy. The deployment of long-range aircraft and the development of superior radar and sonar technology, technological leaps made possible by American industry and science, systematically stripped the U-boats of their advantage. Industrial replacement. The sheer pace of U.S. shipbuilding, Liberty ships, eventually overwhelmed German capacity, ensuring that more tonnage reached Britain than was sunk. By late 1943, the Battle of the Atlantic was largely won. The successful execution of Bolero meant that by the time of D-Day in 1944, Great Britain was brimming with American troops, hospitals, airfields, and most importantly, mountains of supplies. The combined power of American industry and the Anglo-American Strategic Partnership had successfully established the logistical base for the final assault on Nazi Germany. The Europe First strategy was a triumph of long-term geopolitical thinking over short-term emotional pressure. It ensured that the full weight of American power would be applied where the greatest threat was, and it created the most integrated and effective military alliance in modern history, one that would, in time, guarantee the eventual collapse of the Axis powers.
If the Europe First strategy was the brain of the Allied war effort, the Battle of the Atlantic was its lifeline. The vast ocean, stretching over 3,000 miles from the American eastern seaboard to the shores of Great Britain, was not merely a route, but the decisive battlefield upon which the entire war hinged. The colossal industrial output of the arsenal of democracy meant nothing if the ships carrying tanks, planes, food, and fuel, the very means of fighting, sank to the bottom before reaching their destination. The German U-boats, submarines, were the instrument of this potential strangulation, waging a relentless campaign of total economic warfare designed to starve Britain into submission and sever the supply line to the developing European front. The Black Pit, U-boat dominance, 1941 to 1942. When the United States formally entered the war in December 1941, the Battle of the Atlantic immediately entered its most terrifying phase. German U-boat command, led by Admiral Karl Dönitz, launched Operation Drumbeat, or Paukenschlag, moving U-boats from the heavily patrolled waters of the mid-Atlantic to the completely unprepared American East Coast. This became known to the crews as the Second Happy Time. The American response was disorganized and slow. Coastal cities, focused on the war on the Pacific, continued their peacetime illumination, effectively silhouetting Allied merchant ships for the U-boats prowling just offshore. The lack of a coordinated convoy system, coupled with the U.S. Navy's inexperience in anti-submarine warfare, ASW, allowed the German Iron Wolves to wreak havoc. Merchant ships were sunk at an alarming rate, often within sight of the beaches of New Jersey and Florida. Survivors recounted the sickening sight of burning oil tankers lighting up the night sky, and the helplessness of watching comrades drown as the U-boat slipped silently away. In the first half of 1942, losses were catastrophic. Hundreds of ships were sunk, translating to millions of tons of desperately needed materiel lost. The U-boats operated with impunity, often hunting in coordinated packs, the infamous wolf packs, which submerged during the day and surfaced at night to attack convoys. The sheer speed of the German success threatened to paralyze the American supply chain before the mobilization effort could even reach Europe. Churchill later stated that the only thing that truly frightened him during the war was the U-boat menace. The rate of sinkings in early 1942 was simply unsustainable, threatening the eventual success of the crucial Europe First strategy, which required the logistical buildup known as Operation Bolero in Britain. The American response: building the anti-submarine infrastructure. The crisis demanded a drastic and immediate overhaul of American naval strategy, technology, and production. The American naval establishment, dominated by large ship proponents focused on the Pacific, had to rapidly adapt to the dirty, deadly, and frustrating reality of ASW. 1. The convoy system. The single most immediate and effective countermeasure was the implementation of the convoy system. Abandoning the futile practice of allowing ships to travel independently, the U.S. Navy and Coast Guard quickly organized vessels into massive, coordinated convoys protected by naval escorts. The logic was simple: better to lose one escort ship protecting 50 merchant ships than lose 5 ships scattered across the ocean. While the convoys were prime targets for wolf packs, the concentration of defensive firepower made the attacks far riskier for the U-boats. 3. The Liberty Ship lifeline. Crucially, the success of the convoys relied on the furious pace of American industrial output. Henry J. Kaiser's Liberty ships, mass-produced in just weeks, were the vessels that carried the bloodline of the war. While dozens ships might sink in a week, the American shipyards were launching 20 new ones. The Allied strategy was brutal: outproduce the enemy's destructive capacity. The Axis could not sink American ships faster than America could build them. 4. New ASW technology. The technological arms race in the Atlantic was constant and decisive. The U.S. poured resources into developing and mass-producing new tools. HFDF, high-frequency direction finding, known as HFDF. This technology allowed escort vessels to pinpoint the location of a U-boat the moment it surfaced and transmitted a radio message to its command center. This gave the hunters an immediate bearing on the position of the wolf pack. Improved sonar. Constant development refined sonar capabilities, allowing escorts to detect submerged U-boats at greater distances and track them more effectively. Depth charges. The main anti-submarine weapon was the depth charge, a barrel of explosives detonated at a preset depth. The U.S. introduced superior pattern firing systems like the Hedgehog, a forward-throwing mortar that scattered small contact-fused bombs ahead of the ship, allowing the escort to maintain sonar contact while attacking. The air bridge, closing the black gap. Despite the convoy system and new technologies, a massive, unpatrolled area remained in the central Atlantic, a logistical nightmare known as the Black Gap. This region was beyond the range of land-based Allied aircraft coverage from either North America or Britain, providing the U-boats with a sanctuary where they could gather, refuel, and attack with impunity. The Americans closed this gap using 2 key innovations that brought air power to the deep ocean. Very long-range aircraft. American manufacturers modified bombers, particularly the B-24 Liberator, for VLR missions. By stripping unnecessary weight and adding huge auxiliary fuel tanks,
These planes could fly thousands of miles to patrol the mid-Atlantic, forcing U-boats to remain submerged and slowing their offensive operations. Escort carriers, CVEs, these small, quickly built aircraft carriers, often converted from merchant hulls, were the indispensable solution. They were slow and vulnerable, earning the nickname Jeep carriers, but they carried a deck of anti-submarine aircraft right into the heart of the convoy lanes. The presence of just one CVE could break up a wolf pack attack and force the U-boats to withdraw. The CVVs were a direct result of the American ability to mass-produce naval assets cheaply and quickly. The turning point, May 1943. The grinding technological and industrial war reached its climax in the spring of 1943. After months of devastating losses, the tide finally turned. A confluence of factors: the full deployment of VLR aircraft, the establishment of permanent CVE escort groups, the proliferation of radar, and the sheer number of new destroyer escorts coming from American yards pushed the German U-boat fleet to the brink. In May 1943, a month that would be marked forever as the decisive victory in the Atlantic, the Allies sank a shocking 41 U-boats while suffering relatively minor losses of merchant shipping. The German U-boat fleet had reached its maximum strength and its maximum loss rate simultaneously. Admiral Dönitz was horrified. His highly trained, elite force was being decimated by an enemy that could see them, track them, and replace their own losses at will. Recognizing the unsustainable casualties, Dönitz reluctantly withdrew the bulk of the U-boat fleet from the North Atlantic convoy routes. The Black Gap was closed, the wolf packs dispersed, and the threat to the crucial North Atlantic lifeline was effectively neutralized. The Battle of the Atlantic, though continuing in pockets until the end of the war, was fundamentally won by the Allies in the spring of 1943.
The unsung heroes, the American naval contribution. The victory was paid for by the immense sacrifice of the U.S. Navy and Coast Guard, which suffered hundreds of casualties in the unforgiving, freezing waters of the North Atlantic. The crews of the destroyer escorts and the often overlooked Coast Guard cutters were the unsung heroes, enduring brutal storms, constant threat, and the grueling monotony of convoy duty. Their job was a psychological and physical drain, spending days staring into the dense fog or icy waves, waiting for the telltale ping of sonar or the splash of a torpedo. These young sailors learned to rely on teamwork and technological precision to defeat an invisible, ruthless enemy. The triumph was a victory not of massive firepower, but of applied science, industrial capacity, and relentless operational endurance. The strategic payoff. Winning the Battle of the Atlantic was the prerequisite for all subsequent Allied victories. The secured sea lanes meant that the material backbone of the Europe First strategy was now stable. Sustaining the Soviets, Lend-Lease supplies, tanks, trucks, and locomotives continued to pour into the Soviet Union via the Arctic convoys and Iranian routes, keeping the Eastern Front viable. Launching the invasions, Operation Bolero was completed, allowing millions of tons of U.S. equipment and over 1.5 million American soldiers to safely stage in Great Britain, preparing for the cross-channel invasion. Oil flow. The steady, uninterrupted flow of American oil and fuel ensured that the massive American air forces and tank divisions had the energy needed for sustained operations in both the European and Mediterranean theaters. The Battle of the Seas was a quiet, brutal, and often overlooked victory.
It had none of the public drama of a land battle, but its successful conclusion in 1943 ensured that when the Allied armies finally crossed the English Channel to invade France in 1944, they would be backed by an inexhaustible mountain of American materiel, the ultimate determinant of victory. The supply lines held, and the path to Hitler's defeat was secure. Operation Torch, the North African Crucible, 1942-1943. The year 1942 was defined by the Allied commitment to Europe first, but the question remained where to strike. The Soviets desperately demanded a full second front in France, a demand the American generals, led by the strategic pragmatist George C. Marshall, supported. Yet Britain's Winston Churchill harbored a profound fear of a premature cross-channel invasion, haunted by the memory of World War I trench carnage. He argued for a peripheral strike, attacking the axis where they were weakest, the soft underbelly of North Africa. Ultimately, President Franklin Roosevelt sided with Churchill, prioritizing getting American troops into action against Germany immediately. The result was Operation Torch, launched in November 1942, America's first major combat operation in the European, African, Mediterranean theater, and the crucible in which the newly conscripted U.S. Army would be tested. The birth of a commander. Eisenhower takes the stage. The decision to invade French North Africa, specifically Morocco and Algeria, which were under the control of the Vichy French regime, nominally aligned with Germany, was fraught with political complexity. The operation required a commander with not only military skill but also diplomatic finesse. The combined chiefs of staff selected a little-known, politically astute American, Lieutenant General Dwight Eisenhower. Eisenhower had never commanded troops in combat, but he possessed an extraordinary ability to harmonize the often clashing egos and conflicting national interests of the Allied powers. His primary task was political, to ensure that the invading American and British forces, a combined Anglo-American army of over 100,000 troops, did not get bogged down fighting the Vichy French forces. He had to negotiate the tricky balance of warfare and diplomacy, navigating a minefield of French loyalties. The operation itself, launched on November 8, 1942, was a colossal logistical feat. It involved landing 3 separate task forces at Casablanca in Morocco and at Oran and Algiers in Algeria. The American contribution was immense, marking the first time the U.S. Army had fought in the hemisphere since the Civil War. The initial landings were tense. At Casablanca, American forces under the controversial Major General George S. Patton faced unexpectedly fierce, though brief, resistance from the Vichy French. American casualties were incurred, but the resistance largely collapsed within 3 days, thanks to rapid negotiation and the political work of figures like Robert Murphy, Roosevelt's envoy. The capture of the ports of Algiers and Oran provided the essential staging areas. The immediate goal was to race eastward toward Tunisia, the last Axis bastion in North Africa, and trap the German-Italian forces retreating westward from the crushing British victory at El Alamein in Egypt.
2. The baptism by fire. Kasserine Pass. The success of the landings was swiftly overshadowed by the harsh realities of facing the professional, battle-hardened troops of the German Afrika Korps. The rush toward Tunisia brought the American troops, who were mostly green, into direct contact with the most lethal armored divisions in the world, led by the infamous Field Marshal Erwin Rommel, the Desert Fox. The inevitable clash came in February 1943 at the Kasserine Pass, a crucial gap in the Atlas Mountains. The battle was a disaster for the American forces. Rommel, recognizing the inexperience of the American units, launched a sharp, powerful counterattack through the pass.
The American troops were hampered by fragmented command structures, poor communication, and a lack of faith in the lethality of the German offensive. American tanks and infantry were often poorly coordinated, leaving them vulnerable to the veteran tactics of the Afrika Korps. The famed M4 Sherman tanks, the backbone of the American armor, proved tragically flammable against the long-barreled German anti-tank guns and the heavier Panzer IV tanks. The result was a shocking, demoralizing rout. American troops suffered over 6,500 casualties and lost hundreds of tanks, trucks, and guns. The American forces retreated nearly 50 miles, the heaviest defeat suffered by the U.S. Army in the war up to that point. The psychological damage was immense. The untested soldiers had met a formidable, terrifying enemy and had been soundly defeated. Field Marshal Rommel, the Desert Fox, was an experienced and talented commander, but even he could not stop the overwhelming Allied forces in the North African campaign. The island-hopping campaign begins. Early Pacific battles. While the strategic focus of the United States was fixed on Europe first, the war in the Pacific was a present, terrifying reality. The Japanese attack on Pearl Harbor was merely the opening salvo in a vast, brutal campaign of conquest. Following December 7, 1941, the American military was humiliated, disorganized, and seemingly powerless to stop the Imperial Japanese Navy, IJN, as it swept across Southeast Asia and the Western Pacific. This early period was defined by disastrous defeats, but also by acts of desperate defiance that laid the emotional and strategic groundwork for the eventual American counteroffensive, which would soon coalesce into the grim, grinding strategy of island hopping. The tsunami of conquest. Initial American defeat. The immediate months following Pearl Harbor were a nightmare of cascading Allied losses. Japan launched a coordinated, near-simultaneous series of invasions across the Pacific, demonstrating a well-planned operational superiority. Key American outposts fell swiftly. Wake Island and Guam. These small garrisons, isolated and overwhelmed, fell within weeks of the initial attack, signaling the end of the U.S. presence in the Central Pacific. The Philippines Campaign. This was the major focus of Japanese attention. The forces of the U.S. Army and the Philippine Commonwealth Army, led by General Douglas MacArthur, were quickly pushed back. After weeks of fierce, hopeless fighting, the main American forces were forced to retreat to the Bataan Peninsula and the fortress island of Corregidor. MacArthur was famously ordered out by President Roosevelt, vowing, "I shall return." The subsequent surrender of American and Filipino forces at Bataan in April 1942 led to the infamous Bataan Death March, a horrific forced transfer of prisoners that became an indelible symbol of Japanese brutality and fueled American rage. Southeast Asia. Simultaneously, the Japanese swallowed British Hong Kong, Malaya, and the impregnable Singapore, the Dutch East Indies, securing vital oil supplies, and Burma. By the spring of 1942, Japan had established a seemingly impenetrable defensive perimeter across an area 3 times the size of the United States. The American and Allied presence in the Pacific was reduced to a few desperate garrisons, primarily concentrated in Australia and Hawaii. The momentum was entirely with the Empire of Japan. The retort. Doolittle's audacity. April 1942. The American public, battered by months of humiliating defeats, desperately needed a morale boost. They needed a visible, aggressive strike against the Japanese homeland to prove the war was not a one-sided calamity. Strategic planners devised a mission of almost suicidal audacity, the Doolittle Raid. The plan, championed by President Roosevelt and commanded by Lieutenant Colonel Jimmy Doolittle, called for 16 B-25 Mitchell medium bombers, aircraft never designed to take off from a carrier deck, to launch from the USS Hornet. The bombers would strike Tokyo and other Japanese cities, and then, unable to land back on the carrier, proceed to land in friendly territory and unoccupied China. The raid, executed on April 18, 1942, was fraught with risk. The task force was spotted prematurely by a Japanese patrol boat, forcing Doolittle to launch his planes over 170 miles earlier than planned. This meant the bombers would almost certainly run out of fuel before reaching the safety of China. The actual physical damage inflicted on Tokyo was minimal. However, the psychological and strategic impact was massive. American morale. The raid was an electrifying success for the American home front. It proved that the Japanese mainland was vulnerable and showed the world that the U.S. was capable of striking back. The narrative of American resilience and ingenuity was powerfully cemented. Japanese strategy. For the Japanese military, the attack was a profound national disgrace. It was unacceptable that the emperor's person and palace were threatened. This humiliation directly spurred the Japanese High Command to approve the decisive, fatal strategic error that would follow: the plan to draw out and destroy the surviving U.S. fleet at Midway Atoll. III, the strategic apex, the Battle of Midway, June 1942. The true turning point of the Pacific War came 7 weeks after the Doolittle raid. Determined to eliminate the threat of further attacks and destroy the remaining U.S. carriers, Admiral Isoroku Yamamoto, the architect of Pearl Harbor, planned a massive, complex operation to seize the strategically vital Midway Atoll and trap the American fleet. Yamamoto commanded a huge force, including 4 of the IJN's 6 fleet carriers. American intelligence, however, held the key. Naval cryptoanalysts had partially broken the Japanese naval code, JN-25B. The U.S. Navy Command, led by Admiral Nimitz, correctly deduced the Japanese target, Midway, and the approximate timing of the attack. Nimitz took a huge gamble, committing all available resources, the carriers USS Enterprise, Hornet, and Yorktown, the latter hastily repaired after a previous battle, to ambush the Japanese invasion force. The battle, June 4th to 7th, 1942. The battle unfolded as a classic aircraft carrier engagement, fought entirely by aircraft operating hundreds of miles apart. In a stunning reversal of fortune, American dive bombers, having located the Japanese carrier task force while the Japanese planes were caught refueling and rearming below deck, struck with devastating precision. In less than 6 minutes, 3 of the 4 Japanese fleet carriers, Akagi, Kaga, and Soryu, were reduced to burning wrecks. Later that day, the 4th carrier, the Hiryu, was located and sunk. The cost to the U.S. was 1 carrier, the venerable USS Yorktown, but the outcome was revolutionary. The Japanese lost 4 irreplaceable fleet carriers and over 250 highly trained pilots, a loss the IJN's training programs could never recover. The aftermath. Midway was the high watermark of Japanese expansion. It achieved 2 things. It saved the Central Pacific from immediate Japanese invasion, and it decisively crippled the Imperial Japanese Navy's offensive carrier strike force. From this day forward, the strategic initiative passed to the United States. The war would no longer be a series of Japanese conquests. It would be a slow, grinding process of American reclamation. IV, the pivot to offensive, defining island hopping.
The Pacific Ocean was dotted with thousands of islands, many garrisoned by Japanese forces.
A strategy of capturing every single island would have resulted in unacceptable casualties and consumed years. Island hopping offered a pragmatic solution. Bypass and isolate. American forces would identify and seize only the strategically vital islands, those necessary for forward air bases or naval refueling stations. Strangulation. Heavily fortified Japanese islands that pose no immediate strategic threat, like the massive Japanese base at Rabaul, would be bypassed or hopped over. Cut off from supply lines by American sea and air power, the bypassed garrisons would be left to wither on the vine, starving and isolated, their fighting capability neutralized without the need for a bloody invasion. This strategy, driven by the need to conserve manpower and accelerate the timeline, was a massive logistical challenge, but it was strategically sound. It required the close coordination of the two main American commands. Admiral Chester W. Nimitz, Central Pacific Command, directed forces aiming across the Central Pacific towards the Japanese home islands, targeting islands like the Gilbert, Marshall, and Mariana Chains. And General Douglas MacArthur, Southwest Pacific Area Command, directed forces advancing along the northern coast of New Guinea and into the Philippines, fulfilling his promise to return. The first test of this new offensive, and the moment America committed to a brutal war of attrition in the Pacific jungles, was the Guadalcanal Campaign. The first beachhead, Guadalcanal, August 1942 through February 1943. The American counteroffensive began on August 7, 1942, with the invasion of Guadalcanal in the Solomon Islands. The objective was to capture a strategically located, partially completed Japanese airfield, which was instantly renamed Henderson Field and became the pivot point of the campaign. The 6-month-long struggle for Guadalcanal was unlike anything the young American Marines and soldiers had yet encountered. It was a vicious, unremitting campaign fought not just against the determined Japanese, but against the brutal tropical environment. Jungle warfare. Combat was fought hand-to-hand in dense, fetid jungle marked by relentless rain, disease, malaria, and tropical fevers were often more deadly than bullets, and exhaustion. The Japanese forces fought with a savage tenacity, adhering to the Bushido Code, which decreed fighting to the death rather than surrender. The slot, an iron-bottom sound. The waters surrounding Guadalcanal, known as the slot, became the site of 7 major naval battles, many fought at night. The sheer number of sunken ships from both sides led to the waters being tragically nicknamed Iron Bottom Sound. The U.S. Navy and the IJN engaged in a continuous struggle to ferry supplies and reinforcements, known respectively as the Cactus Express and the Tokyo Express. Air control. The battle was primarily fought for control of Henderson Field. The American fighter pilots and ground crews, constantly under fire, worked tirelessly to keep the field operational, flying vital missions against Japanese resupply efforts and bombing runs. The Guadalcanal campaign was a near-run thing, costing the U.S. Navy critical assets and thousands of men. Yet, by February 1943, the Japanese withdrew, abandoning the island. Guadalcanal was the proving ground that defined the American Pacific warrior. It taught the U.S. military the grim, hard lessons of jungle warfare, the tenacity of the Japanese enemy, and the necessity of coordinated air and naval support. It was the crucial first step of the island-hopping strategy, signifying that the long, bloody road back to Tokyo had officially begun. The days of Japanese dominance were over, replaced by a relentless industrial grinder powered by American might.
Guadalcanal, the brutal test of jungle warfare. The victory at Midway had shifted the strategic balance in the Pacific, but it was the protracted 6-month battle for Guadalcanal that forced the United States to confront the savage, uncompromising reality of jungle warfare. This island, a malaria-ridden volcanic speck in the Solomon Islands chain, became the location of America's first major ground offensive against the Japanese Empire, initiated in August 1942. It was a grinding, agonizing crucible where American Marines and soldiers fought not just against a fanatically determined enemy, but against a lethal environment of disease, starvation, and fear. Guadalcanal was where the U.S. learned, through blood and agony, how to win the Pacific War. 1. The initial landings and the prize, Henderson Field. The decision to invade Guadalcanal was precipitated by intelligence that the Japanese were building an airfield on the island, positioning them to threaten Allied supply lines to Australia. Capturing this airfield, later renamed Henderson Field, became the singular, desperate objective of the campaign. On August 7, 1942, the 1st Marine Division, led by Major General Alexander Vandegrift, executed the amphibious landing. The initial invasion was a surprise and faced little organized resistance. The Japanese garrison, mostly consisting of construction engineers, quickly fled into the dense, unexplored interior of the island. The Marines rapidly secured the beachhead and the unfinished airfield, which was put into immediate use, quickly becoming the most strategically vital 3,800 feet of dirt in the entire Pacific theater. The early days were defined by relative ease on the ground, but catastrophic vulnerability at sea. Due to a series of command decisions and the proximity of superior Japanese naval forces, the American naval support withdrew prematurely on August 9th, following a devastating defeat at the Battle of Savo Island, where 4 Allied heavy cruisers were sunk. This withdrawal left the Marines isolated, without heavy equipment, reliable air cover, or steady resupply. They were marooned on a hostile island, forced to live off captured Japanese rice and meager supplies, with the entire might of the Japanese military determined to eliminate them. 2. The battle for the grasping hand. The true character of the Guadalcanal campaign emerged not from massive pitched battles, but from small, brutal skirmishes in the fetid, rain-soaked jungle. The terrain itself was an enemy, choked with vines, swamps, and steep ridges, making movement a constant, exhausting struggle. The average day was a contest against extreme heat, torrential rainfall, and the constant threat of deadly tropical diseases, primarily malaria, which incapacitated more troops than enemy bullets in the early months. The Marines dug in around Henderson Field, transforming the small perimeter into a desperate fortress. The Japanese, adhering to the Bushido Code, which prized offensive action and fighting to the last man, refused to accept defeat and launched a series of ferocious counterattacks, often using a method known as infiltration or banzai charges. Bloody Ridge and the tenacity of the Japanese. The first major ground clash occurred in late August when Colonel Kiyonao Ichiki led a frontal banzai charge against the Marine defenses at the Tanaru River. The disciplined American machine gun fire and artillery barrage decimated the charging Japanese force. The most famous and brutal of these attacks was the Battle of Bloody Ridge, known to the Japanese as the Battle of the Setting Sun, in mid-September. The Japanese forces under General Kiyotake Kawaguchi launched a multi-pronged assault aimed at slicing through the Marine lines and seizing Henderson Field. The fighting was savage and often hand-to-hand, fought over steep jungle-covered slopes. The Marines held their line through sheer willpower and superior firepower. The Japanese displayed a terrifying refusal to surrender, attacking relentlessly until their units were almost entirely annihilated. The sheer, overwhelming determination of the Japanese forced the Americans to fight with a similar level of commitment. 3. Iron Bottom Sound and the Tokyo Express. The struggle for the island quickly devolved into a logistical war fought almost entirely at sea. The channel separating the islands, tragically named Iron Bottom Sound, became a watery graveyard for dozens of American and Japanese warships. The Japanese utilized the speed of their destroyers to run nighttime reinforcement and resupply missions down the slot
towards Guadalcanal. These became known as the Tokyo Express. The U.S. Navy and Marine pilots of the Cactus Air Force, operating off Henderson Field, had air superiority during the day, making large-scale Japanese troop landings impossible. Therefore, the Japanese relied entirely on the night.
The resulting naval battles, the Battle of Cape Esperance, the Naval Battle of Guadalcanal, and others, were some of the most complex, confused, and desperate surface engagements of the entire war. The American Navy sustained heavy losses, often losing ships and men due to the Japanese advantage in night-fighting tactics and the devastating punch of their long-lance torpedoes. The loss of life and materiel was constant, demonstrating that even with the strategic initiative, the cost of holding Guadalcanal was immense and continuous. By October 1942, the Marines were exhausted and severely depleted by combat and disease. President Roosevelt and the combined chiefs of staff, realizing the campaign had escalated from an opportunistic raid to a decisive battle for the future of the South Pacific, committed to massive reinforcements. The Army's Americal Division and the 25th Infantry Division were fed into the line, relieving the weary Marines. The Army soldiers, less experienced in amphibious operations but eager to fight, took over the defense of the extended perimeter. The Japanese also poured resources into the fight, launching their final massive ground offensive in late October. This attack, which again centered on desperate nighttime assaults against the Marine Army line, was ultimately broken by the sustained coordinated firepower of the American artillery and machine guns. The turning point was the naval battle of Guadalcanal in mid-November 1942. This was the most vicious and complex naval engagement of the campaign. The U.S. Navy, despite taking heavy losses, finally repelled a massive Japanese naval force carrying thousands of reinforcements and crucial supplies. The Japanese lost 2 battleships, a heavy cruiser, and several transports. This defeat was decisive. The Japanese High Command realized they could no longer sustain the supply line and had permanently lost the ability to contest the seas around the island. January 1943, realizing the cause was hopeless, the Japanese began Operation K, a brilliant and swift evacuation of their remaining forces under the cover of darkness. By February 9, 1943, the island was declared secured. Guadalcanal cost the United States approximately 7,100 men killed and 1,200 aircraft lost, alongside numerous ships. The Japanese suffered a devastating loss of over 30,000 dead, mostly from combat, starvation, and disease, alongside the irreparable loss of trained pilots and destroyers. The legacy of Guadalcanal was transformative for the American war effort. The dominance of logistics. The battle highlighted the essential, overriding importance of logistics. The side that could deliver men, supplies, and fuel to the fight, and sustain them, would ultimately win. The American ability to build and deploy escort carriers and keep Henderson Field operational proved the decisive factor. Validation of island hopping. Though not initially conceived as a bypass, the ultimate victory validated the new strategy. The seizure of Guadalcanal prevented the Japanese from cutting off the Australian supply line and provided a vital forward air and naval base, allowing the American advance to continue up the Solomon chain. Forger of men. Most profoundly, Guadalcanal taught the American soldier how to survive and fight in the Pacific. It forced the military to prioritize tropical medicine, improve the quality of rations, and critically, respect the discipline and ferocity of the Japanese enemy while mastering the tactics of jungle warfare,
the need for fire superiority, close-in fighting, and overwhelming support. The victory was not celebrated, it was merely noted with grim relief. The soldiers and Marines who emerged from the jungle were no longer the green recruits of the previous year. They were veterans, hardened by the brutal crucible of Guadalcanal, the true beginning of America's long, bloody march across the Pacific.
The Sicilian and Italian campaigns. The soft underbelly. The dust of the North African desert had barely settled when the Allies were faced with the next crucial strategic decision: where to strike the Axis next. Winston Churchill, the great champion of peripheral strategy, passionately argued for the invasion of Italy, famously calling it the soft underbelly of Europe. His logic was seductive. Knocking Italy out of the war would force the Germans to divert significant forces to cover the southern flank, open the Mediterranean to Allied shipping, and demoralize the Axis alliance. To many American generals, especially George C. Marshall, this was a costly, unnecessary diversion from the main event, the cross-channel invasion of France, Operation Overlord. Yet, President Roosevelt, guided by the imperative to keep American troops fighting and to maintain unity with the British, conceded. The result was the Sicilian and Italian campaigns, a grinding, brutal, year-and-a-half-long struggle that proved the soft underbelly was encased in mountain granite and defended by the most tenacious soldiers in the Wehrmacht. 1. Operation Husky, the Seizure of Sicily, July 1943. The first step was the invasion of Sicily, Operation Husky, launched on the night of July 9-10, 1943. It was at the time the largest amphibious operation ever attempted, involving over 160,000 troops, 3,200 ships, and thousands of aircraft. The invasion was a model of Allied cooperation, though the command structure was carefully balanced. General Dwight Eisenhower was overall commander, with two primary ground forces: General Sir Bernard Montgomery's veteran British 8th Army, and Lieutenant General George S. Patton's newly designated U.S. 7th Army. The initial landings, aided by daring deception campaigns, like the legendary The Man Who Never Was, were successful. The American forces landed on the southwestern coast, while the British landed on the southeast, aiming for the island's key port, Messina, which was the German escape route back to the mainland. The Sicilian campaign quickly became defined by two things: the ruthlessness of the terrain and the fiery rivalry between Patton and Montgomery. While Montgomery bogged down in the central, heavily defended volcanic slopes around Mount Etna, Patton, infuriated by his subordinate role, aggressively wheeled his 7th Army westward, rapidly liberating Palermo before pivoting back eastward in a dramatic, high-speed dash for Messina. Patton's highly mobile, aggressive style contrasted sharply with Montgomery's methodical approach, creating friction that was a constant irritant to Eisenhower. The ultimate objective, Messina, was reached on August 17, 1943, but the victory was bittersweet. Despite the successful capture of the island and the expulsion of the Axis forces, the Germans had executed a brilliant withdrawal. Under the cover of heavy air and naval defenses, they managed to evacuate over 60,000 German troops and 10,000 vehicles across the Strait of Messina to the mainland. Sicily was conquered, but the core of the fighting enemy had escaped to fight again. 2. The political prize and the German response. The political fallout from the Sicilian campaign was immediate and profound. On July 25, 1943, King Victor Emmanuel III, backed by disgruntled Italian fascist leaders, arrested Benito Mussolini and dissolved the fascist government. This apparent collapse of Axis power was the great prize Churchill had sought. It seemed Italy was indeed the soft underbelly ready to be cracked open. The Allies pressed their advantage swiftly.
On September 3rd, Montgomery's forces crossed the Strait of Messina, Operation Baytown, making the first symbolic landings on the toe of the Italian mainland. 5 days later, on September 8th, the world was stunned. Italy formally surrendered to the Allies. The celebration was premature. German Field Marshal Albert Kesselring, commander of the German forces in Italy, had anticipated the Italian defection. His pre-planned response, Operation Axis, was executed with chilling efficiency. Before the Allied forces could fully exploit the surrender, German troops swiftly disarmed Italian units across the entire country, seizing key infrastructure, airfields, and most crucially, all the formidable defensive positions. Italy was no longer an Axis partner, it was an occupied German fortress. The main American landing, Operation Avalanche, commenced on September 9th near Naples. The hope was to seize the port of Naples and cut off German forces in southern Italy. Instead, the Americans were met by surrendering Italians, but by concentrated, furious German resistance. The U.S. 7th Army, under General Mark Clark, nearly failed. For days, the Salerno beachhead hung by a thread, subjected to massive counterattacks from German armored divisions and relentless artillery fire. Only the timely intervention of Allied naval gunfire, fired at point-blank range, and massive air support saved the invasion from being thrown back into the sea. The Americans had received their first brutal lesson. This was not a swift occupation, but a grueling war against a masterful defensive enemy. 3. The Gothic battlefield, terrain as a weapon. As the Allies slowly fought their way north, it became painfully clear that Italy was the worst possible place for an invasion. Churchill's soft underbelly turned out to be the bony spine of the Apennine Mountains, which runs the length of the Italian peninsula. The Italian geography dictated the nature of the war. Natural defenses. Every ridge, mountain pass, and ravine provided the Germans with a ready-made defensive position. The enemy simply had to blow up a bridge or tunnel, sight a few machine guns on a crest, and they could hold up an entire Allied corps. Weather and mud. The campaign was fought almost entirely in brutal conditions. The torrential autumn rains turned the narrow, winding mountain roads into impassable mud tracks. Visibility was often nil, grounding Allied air power and turning every advance into a logistical nightmare. Tanks, the great symbols of speed and mobility, became expensive, heavy targets mired in the quagmire. Kesselring, a brilliant defensive strategist, exploited this terrain perfectly. He adopted a strategy of fighting delaying actions rather than pitched battles. His forces would hold the line just long enough to inflict maximum casualties, then fall back to another pre-prepared defensive position a few miles north. This conserved his strength and inflicted a debilitating death by 1,000 cuts on the advancing Allies. The advance became agonizingly slow, measured in yards per day. The soldiers, fighting in freezing cold and unrelenting rain, began to refer to themselves as the doughboys in the mud.
4. The Gustav Line and the Calamity of Monte Cassino. By the end of 1943, the Allied advance stalled completely at the Gustav Line, a formidable network of permanent defenses across the narrowest part of the peninsula, anchored by the rapid-flowing Rapido and Garigliano rivers. The key to the entire line was the mountain high ground overlooking the Liri Valley, specifically the height crowned by the ancient Monte Cassino Abbey. The ensuing battles from Monte Cassino, stretching from January to May 1944, were among the bloodiest and most controversial of the Western Front. The Abbey controversy. American and Allied commanders became convinced that German spotters were using the historic 6th century Benedictine Abbey on the summit as an observation post to direct deadly artillery fire onto the Allied approaches. Though German commanders vehemently denied occupying the abbey itself, their positions were in the surrounding hills.
the strategic imperative to remove the perceived threat became overwhelming. The bombing. On February 15, 1944, in a highly controversial decision, the Abbey was subjected to a massive aerial bombardment, reducing the historic structure to rubble. The decision proved to be a tragic mistake. While the Allied forces gained a moral victory by eliminating the symbol, the rubble created by the bombing provided the Germans with superior rubble fortifications. The surviving German paratroopers, the Fallschirmjäger, moved into the ruins and fought even harder. 4 massive Allied assaults failed, shattering multiple divisions: Indian, New Zealand, Polish, British, and American. The ultimate breakthrough was only achieved in May 1944 after a multinational force, including the famed Polish Second Corps, finally cleared the mountain and shattered the line. The cost was staggering, a symbol of the war's sheer brutality and the tactical advantage held by the defender. V. The Anzio Gamble, the trapped beachhead. To break the stalemate at the Gustav Line, Allied planners gambled on an audacious flanking maneuver, Operation Shingle, the amphibious landing at Anzio in January 1944, nearly 70 miles behind the Gustav Line. The goal was to force Kesselring to pull his forces off the line to deal with the threat, thus opening the road to Rome. The initial landing was unopposed, achieving complete surprise. However, the subsequent command decision proved fatal. Instead of immediately driving inland to seize the Alban Hills, the high ground necessary to threaten Kesselring's rear, General John P. Lucas, the American commander, chose to consolidate his beachhead, fearing a counterattack. Kesselring responded instantly. Instead of retreating, he rushed 10 divisions to seal off the beachhead, transforming the landing zone into a terrifying, concentrated siege. The Allies were trapped in a small, flat coastal area within range of every German artillery piece in the surrounding hills. Soldiers lived and fought in waterlogged foxholes, constantly hammered by artillery that earned the beachhead the grim nickname Hell's Half-Acre. For 4 months, the Anzio forces, mostly American and British, endured a brutal, static war of attrition, with the German forces determined to push them into the sea. Anzio became a symbol of the desperate, high-cost struggle that characterized the entire Italian campaign. VI, the capture of Rome and the campaign's legacy. The ultimate breakthrough from Anzio and the destruction of the Gustav Line only occurred in late May 1944 when the combined forces of the Fifth Army, now under the relentless push of General Mark Clark, finally smashed the German defenses. Clark, motivated by fierce personal ambition and a desire to seize the political glory, controversially ordered his forces to bypass the trapped German 10th Army and drive directly toward Rome. On June 4, 1944, American troops marched into the Eternal City, marking the first Axis capital to fall to the Allies. The political victory was immense, fulfilling one of Churchill's great objectives. But the moment of triumph was tragically undercut by timing. 2 days later, on June 6, 1944, the massive D-Day landings occurred in Normandy, France. The capture of Rome, a front-page story in any other week, was instantly relegated to the back pages, a symbol of the Italian campaign's secondary status. The capture of Rome did not end the fighting. Kesselring successfully executed another tactical withdrawal, establishing the new, formidable Gothic line across the northern Apennines. The long, brutal campaign continued until the final days of the war in April 1945. In retrospect, the Italian campaign was not the soft underbelly of Europe. It was a strategically necessary, humanly costly meat grinder. Its true value lay not in the speed of the advance, but in its strategic drain. It engaged and destroyed the fighting capability of dozens of elite German divisions,
preventing them from being deployed against the Soviets in the East, or, more importantly, against the Allies preparing for Operation Overlord in France. The sacrifice of the American, British, and multinational soldiers in the mud and mountains of Italy ensured the success of the greater Europe First plan, but at a terrible, drawn-out price.
The American Woman's War, Service and the Factory Floor. The mobilization for total war demanded an army of soldiers, but it also required an unprecedented army of labor, stretching the nation's human resources to their absolute limit. With nearly 16 million men ultimately serving in uniform, a profound vacuum was created in the essential functions of the economy and the military's own logistical backbone. Into this breach stepped American women. From the roaring assembly lines of Detroit to the flight lines of Texas and the cryptic code rooms of the Navy, women orchestrated a home front revolution that was both logistical triumph and cultural watershed. Their collective effort, immortalized by the muscular image of Rosie the Riveter, shattered decades of gender conventions, demonstrating for all time that the American woman's capacity was limited only by opportunity. 1. The Great Labor Vacuum and the Birth of Rosie the Riveter. Prior to 1941, women in the workforce were largely restricted to traditional, low-wage occupations, teaching, nursing, domestic service, and clerical work. Manufacturing jobs were rigidly reserved for men, based on the assumption that women lacked the physical strength, mechanical aptitude, or endurance for heavy industry. The Great Depression, while forcing some women to seek work, reinforced the cultural ideal that a woman's primary place was in the home. The demands of total war instantly rendered these assumptions obsolete. As tank production quotas soared and shipbuilding accelerated exponentially, defense plants faced catastrophic labor shortages. The government and industry realized the only untapped labor pool large enough to meet the demand was women. A massive, coordinated propaganda campaign was launched to convince women and skeptical male supervisors that working in a factory was not only acceptable but patriotic. The figurehead of this campaign was Rosie the Riveter. Rosie, famously depicted with her rolled-up sleeve, flexed bicep, and polka-dot bandana, symbolized capability, strength, and defiance. Government posters urged women to do the job he left behind and painted factory work as vital, noble service. The campaign was phenomenally successful. Nearly 6 million women entered the labor force between 1941 and 1945, increasing the total number of working women by over 50%. The composition of the industrial workforce changed dramatically, with women filling nearly 35% of all jobs, including those that required heavy lifting, welding, and complex machining. Life on the assembly line. For the women who answered the call, the reality